The morning my mother-in-law handed me a glass of orange juice with a smile and said, "You're part of this family, sweetheart." I should have known something was wrong. She had never called me sweetheart before, not once in 3 years. That same evening, my husband sat me down at the kitchen table, slid a manila envelope across the surface, and told me to sign. Inside was a document transferring my name off the deed to our house, the house I had put my own savings into, the house we had bought together 2 years after our wedding. He said his mother needed the equity for a medical procedure. He said it was temporary. He said I could trust him. I didn't sign. And that one quiet act of refusal set off a chain of events that would expose a secret so ugly, so buried beneath years of family dinners and holiday photos, that by the time it was all over, nothing in that household would ever be the same. My name is Claire. I was 29 years old, working as a pediatric nurse, married to a man named Daniel for 4 years. We lived in a brick colonial in a suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio. From the outside, we looked fine, better than fine. We looked like the kind of couple people envied at neighborhood block parties, young, stable, seemingly happy. What they didn't see was his mother, Patricia. Patricia was 61 years old, sharp-tongued, meticulous about appearances, and absolutely convinced that her son had married beneath him. She never said it directly. That wasn't her style. She would say things like, "Claire, that's such a brave color for someone with your complexion," or, "You know, nurses work so hard. It must be exhausting to not have a real career path." She wielded politeness like a scalpel. Every compliment had a blade hidden inside it. For 3 years I had smiled through it. I told myself it was generational. I told myself she meant well. I told myself Daniel would eventually see it and step in. He never did. His older brother, Ryan, had married a woman named Melissa 2 years before us. Melissa had stopped coming to family dinners entirely by their second anniversary. I used to wonder why. I understood now. The envelope incident happened in March. A cold Tuesday evening, snow still on the ground, the kind of quiet that makes everything feel heavier than it is. When I refused to sign, Daniel didn't argue. He just picked up the envelope, folded it in half, and put it in his jacket pocket without another word. The silence between us that night was different from other silences. It had weight. 2 weeks later, Patricia called me while Daniel was at work. Her voice was warm in that practiced way of hers, like a radio host who has learned to sound intimate with strangers. She said she wanted to clear the air. She said she was worried about me and Daniel, that she could sense tension, and she wanted to help. She suggested I come for lunch the following Thursday, just the two of us. I went. I don't know why exactly. Maybe I wanted to believe she was sincere. Maybe I was just tired of the low-grade dread that had been sitting in my chest for weeks and thought confronting it might be better than waiting for it. What she said to me over that lunch I will never forget. She told me that she had been speaking to a lawyer. She told me that Daniel had confided in her that our marriage was struggling, that I was emotionally unstable and financially irresponsible, and that she was simply trying to help protect her son's assets before things deteriorated further. She said this with her hands folded on the table and a look of practiced sympathy on her face. As if she were delivering a medical diagnosis, as if she were doing me a favor by telling me. I drove home with my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I wasn't angry anymore. I was something colder than angry. I was calculating. Because what Patricia didn't know, what neither she nor Daniel knew, was that 3 months before that lunch, I had found something. It started with the heating bill. I managed our household finances. Daniel had asked me to, early in our marriage, because he said numbers gave him a headache. So I paid the bills, tracked the accounts, balanced everything, which is why, in December, when I noticed a recurring monthly payment of $840 going to a property management company in a suburb I didn't recognize, I noticed immediately. I asked Daniel about it casually, over dinner. He said it was a storage unit he rented for some tools and equipment from his father's estate. His father had passed 5 years earlier. He said it wasn't a big deal. I let it go. But I didn't forget it. In January, I drove to the address. It wasn't a storage facility. It was a residential apartment complex. A 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor with a balcony and a parking spot registered in the name of a man I had never heard of, a man named Gerald Whitmore. I sat in my car in that parking lot for a long time. Gerald Whitmore, I would later find out, was Patricia's younger brother. He had moved away from Columbus 15 years earlier after a falling out with the family. He and Patricia had supposedly not spoken in over a decade. I knew this because Daniel had mentioned it once, years ago, in passing, as a way of explaining why there were certain subjects that were off limits with his mother. Except that someone was paying $840 a month to house Gerald Whitmore in an apartment 20 minutes from Patricia's house, and that someone was my husband. On a credit card Patricia had co-signed. I spent the following 6 weeks being very quiet about what I knew while being very deliberate about what I found. I requested transaction histories. I cross-referenced dates. I found 2 wire transfers from Patricia's personal account to Gerald, totaling over $40,000 across 18 months. I found emails forwarded to a printer at Daniel's office, emails between Patricia and a name I didn't recognize, discussing a transfer of property in terms that made my stomach drop. I found, buried in a folder in our home office that Daniel used for tax documents, a revised version of his father's will, or rather what appeared to be a revised version. The original will, which I had seen once when we were first married and Daniel's father had just passed, had left the family home and a substantial investment account split evenly between Daniel and Ryan. The version in that folder left everything: the house, the accounts, and a piece of commercial property I hadn't even known existed entirely to Patricia, with a note granting her full discretion over disbursement to her sons. The signatures on both documents were the same, but the date on the revised one was 18 months after the original. 18 months after a man who had died of a stroke could have signed anything. I did not confront Daniel. I did not call Ryan. I did not tell a single person what I had found. I photographed everything with my phone. I printed copies and stored them at my best friend Tamara's apartment. I called an attorney, a woman named Susan Hartley, whose name I found through my hospital's employee assistance program, and I described what I had, and she told me in a very measured, professional voice that I should not move, speak, or do anything until we had met in person. We met the following week. After 2 hours and a second cup of coffee, she told me that what I had described, if the documents held up, constituted fraud. Estate fraud. Potentially forgery. She told me that the fact that Daniel had asked me to sign off the house deed was not incidental, it was part of a pattern. She told me to keep being quiet. She told me my moment would come. My moment came at Easter. Patricia hosted Easter every year. It was one of those non-negotiable family traditions, the kind that functions less as a celebration and more as a performance. Patricia at the center of it, orchestrating everything, making sure everyone understood whose table this was, and whose family this was, and who had the authority in this room. Ryan and Melissa came. Melissa, who I had barely spoken to in years, sat beside me during cocktail hour with a look on her face I recognized. The look of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. Patricia's brother Gerald was there. This was the first time I had ever seen him. He was in his late 50s, unremarkable looking, with the slightly over-careful posture of a man who knows he is somewhere he is not entirely supposed to be. He and Patricia embraced at the door with a warmth that was entirely inconsistent with a decade of estrangement. Daniel watched this and said nothing. Ryan watched this and glanced at Daniel. Nobody spoke about it. I watched everything. Dinner was the usual theater. Patricia complimented Melissa's dress in a way that suggested the dress was slightly too young for her. She told me the green bean casserole I had brought was so homey, which in her vocabulary meant unsophisticated. Daniel laughed at his mother's jokes. Ryan poured more wine than he needed. And then, at dessert, Patricia made her announcement. She said that she had been doing some estate planning, that she wanted to be transparent with her sons about her intentions, and that she had decided to formally transfer ownership of their father's commercial property, the building on Harmon Street, to Gerald, who would manage it on behalf of the family going forward. The table went quiet. Ryan put down his fork. Daniel looked at his mother with an expression I couldn't read entirely. It was somewhere between discomfort and a kind of practiced neutrality, the face of a man who has already been told what is happening and is trying to look appropriately surprised. Ryan said slowly, "Mom, that property was Dad's. That was supposed to be split between me and Daniel." Patricia's expression didn't change. She said Gerald had expertise in commercial real estate, that this was a practical decision, that both her sons would still benefit, that this was simply the most sensible arrangement. Ryan said, "What does Dad's will say?" Patricia said, "I have discretion over these decisions. That was your father's wish." And that was when I reached into my cardigan pocket, pulled out the folded papers I had placed there that morning before we left the house, and set them on the table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't announce anything. I simply unfolded the documents, smoothed them flat with my palm, and said, "I think we should talk about which version of the will we're referring to." The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever sat inside. Patricia's eyes went to the papers. Her face didn't move, but something behind her eyes shifted a rapid, barely perceptible recalculation. Gerald straightened in his chair. Daniel looked at the papers and then at me, and then at the papers again, and something flickered across his face that I had not seen there in a long time. Something that might have been fear. I placed both documents side by side, the original and the revised version. I pointed to the dates. I pointed to the signatures. I said, calmly, that I had had both documents examined by a forensic document specialist, which was true. Susan had arranged it the week before, and that the revised version showed inconsistencies consistent with post-mortem alteration. I said I had also obtained bank records showing $40,000 transferred from Patricia's account to Gerald's over the preceding 18 months. I said I had records of a lease agreement on an apartment in Westerville paid for through a shared credit account belonging to my husband, an apartment registered to Gerald Whitmore, a man who was allegedly estranged from this family. Ryan stood up from the table. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just stood there with his hand on the back of his chair and looked at his mother with the expression of a man watching something he had always half believed finally be confirmed. Then he said, "How long?" Patricia said, "Ryan, sit down. This isn't what it looks like." Ryan said, "How long has Gerald been back? How long have you been moving Dad's money?" Patricia's composure cracked then. Not dramatically, she was too controlled for that, but it cracked. She turned to me with a look that was no longer maternal or sympathetic or even politely hostile. It was something rawer than any of those things. She said, "You had no right to go through our family's private documents." I said, "I'm part of this family. At least, according to the deed to the house I was asked to sign off of." Melissa made a sound that was almost a laugh. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Daniel said my name. Just my name. One word. The way you say someone's name when you're trying to stop them from doing something that can't be undone. But I was already past the point of undoing anything. I told the table that I had not come to Easter dinner intending to do this. That I had spent 3 months sitting with this information, hoping that someone, Daniel, Ryan, anyone would notice what was happening. That I had given my husband every opportunity to be honest with me. That I had been asked, instead, to silently surrender my name from our shared property, while a man I had never met was being financially supported through accounts I managed. Ryan looked at Daniel. He said, "Did you know?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. That pause was its own answer. Ryan said, "Did you know, Daniel?" Daniel said quietly, "Mom told me Gerald needed help. I didn't know about the will." Patricia said sharply, "That is not." Ryan said, "Stop talking, Mom." Gerald had not spoken once since I placed the documents on the table. He was looking at the tablecloth. He looked like a man who had attended a party and gradually realized it was his own funeral. The rest of that Easter dinner did not look like Easter dinner. Ryan called his own attorney from the back porch, his voice low and steady in a way that told me he had been waiting for a reason to make that call for a long time. Melissa sat beside me and said almost nothing, but at one point she put her hand briefly over mine on the table. Patricia sat at the head of her table and said less and less as the evening went on, and each time she said something it carried a little less authority than the time before, and I watched her understand this in real time. Daniel and I drove home in silence. We were halfway there when he said, "I want to explain." I said, "I know." He said, "It's more complicated than." I said, "I know, Daniel. I've known for 3 months. I've had a lot of time to think about what complicated means and what it actually looks like." He didn't say anything more until we got home. We sat in the driveway for a few minutes with the engine off, the neighborhood dark and quiet around us. Then he said, "Are you leaving me?" I thought about the woman who had come to that house 3 years ago, believing that patience was the same as strength. I thought about every dinner I had smiled through, every comment I had absorbed without flinching, every moment I had told myself it would get better, that he would see it, that eventually the scales would balance. I said, "I think the question is whether there's anything left to stay for." He had no answer for that. I think somewhere in him, he already knew. I filed for divorce 6 weeks later. Susan Hartley's firm also filed a formal complaint regarding the estate documents with the probate court. The forensic findings on the revised will were, as Susan had predicted, significant enough to reopen the estate and trigger an investigation. Gerald retained his own attorney and began quietly cooperating in a way that made very clear he had no interest in going down for Patricia's decisions alone. Ryan and Melissa were the ones who pressed forward most aggressively. It turned out Melissa had her own file. A folder she had kept for years in a locked box in her closet, full of financial records and written communications she had saved quietly during the years when Ryan hadn't been ready to look. When she told me this, sitting across from me at a coffee shop 3 weeks after Easter, I understood why she had put her hand over mine at that table. She had been waiting for someone to open the door. The probate investigation took several months. In the end, the original will was reinstated. The Harmon Street property was returned to the estate. Gerald moved out of the Westerville apartment. Patricia was required to repay a substantial portion of the transferred funds, which consumed most of what she had in liquid accounts. She did not go to prison. Her attorney negotiated an agreement that kept it out of criminal court, but the civil findings were public record. Anyone who looked could see them. Daniel and I were divorced by November. It was not a war. He didn't fight the settlement, which gave me my share of the equity in the house and freed me from the mortgage. I think there was a version of him that understood, even if he couldn't fully articulate it, that his silence over the years had not been neutral. That choosing not to look had been its own kind of choice. I moved into an apartment in the Short North neighborhood on the 3rd floor with big windows and decent light. I hung my own curtains. I cooked things I liked. I stayed up late reading without anyone making me feel like that was a strange use of time. It took a while to feel like a person again in the way I had been before. Not the version of myself that had learned to take up less space or smooth over things that shouldn't have been smooth. The version that trusted her own perception of a room. That noticed when a number didn't add up and didn't immediately look for a way to explain it away. Ryan and Melissa and I stayed in touch. Not constantly, but genuinely. He had a lot of shame about how long things had gone on under his nose, and working through that took time. But he was working through it. That counts for something. About a year after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Daniel at a farmer's market on a Saturday morning. He was alone, carrying a canvas bag, looking at tomatoes with the air of a man who had learned to do his own grocery shopping and was still getting comfortable with it. He looked thinner, a little tired. When our eyes met, there was a long moment where neither of us said anything. Then he said, "Hey, Claire." I said, "Hey." He asked how I was. I said I was good, and I meant it. He nodded like that was both what he hoped to hear and what he expected, which told me something about where he was. I wished him well, and I meant that too. Not because what happened was acceptable, but because carrying anger past its useful point is its own kind of cage, and I had spent enough years in cages. What I want to say, to anyone who has been sitting at a table and smiling at comments with blades in them, to anyone who has been handed a document and quietly pressured to sign, to anyone who has been told that their instincts were paranoia or sensitivity or irresponsibility, your instincts are data. They are the first form of evidence. Pay attention to them. I spent 3 years discounting mine. It took one heating bill to remind me that I was capable of paying attention, that I was capable of finding things out. That quiet does not mean powerless, and patience is only a virtue when it's chosen, not imposed. The family you marry into does not define you. The silence you break will.